The dust settled slowly around the wheels of the afternoon stagecoach as it rolled into Copper Ridge. Thomas McKenna stood at the edge of the wooden sidewalk, his weathered hands gripping the brim of his hat so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, desperate for freedom. For 3 months, he had carried the secret that now threatened to tear him apart. 3 months since he had written that letter to the matrimonial agency in San Francisco. 3 months of wondering if he had made the biggest mistake of his life. The town around him buzzed with its usual afternoon energy. Mrs. Henderson swept the porch of her boarding house with determined strokes. Old Pete sat outside the saloon, whittling a piece of cedar and occasionally spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. Children ran between the buildings, their laughter echoing off the sun-baked walls. But Thomas saw none of it. His entire world had narrowed to the stagecoach that now creaked to a halt in front of the depot. The driver, a grizzled man named Colt, climbed down from his seat and began untying luggage from the roof. Steam rose from the horses' flanks as they stamped their feet and snorted, eager to rest after their long journey through the desert. Thomas had built a good life in Copper Ridge. His ranch stretched for miles beyond the town's borders, home to the finest cattle in 3 counties. His house, constructed with his own hands from timber hauled down from the mountains, stood solid and welcoming on a hill overlooking the valley. He had everything a man could want, everything except someone to share it with. The loneliness had crept up on him slowly, like morning fog rolling in from the distant mountains. At first, he had convinced himself that solitude was a choice. He told himself he preferred the quiet evenings on his porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. He insisted he enjoyed eating his meals in silence, reading his books by lamplight, falling asleep to the sound of wind through the cottonwoods. But as the months turned into years, the silence had grown heavy. The empty rooms of his house seemed to echo with possibilities that would never come to pass. The second chair at his kitchen table gathered dust. The space beside him in bed remained cold and untouched. He had tried to court the local women, but Copper Ridge was a small town with limited options. Mary Sullivan had made it clear she preferred the attention of younger men. Helen Porter had married the banker's son last spring, and Sarah Mills, the schoolteacher who had caught his eye at the church social, had politely but firmly declined his invitation to dinner, explaining that she planned to return east at the end of the school term. It was Doc Harrison who had first mentioned the matrimonial agency. They had been sitting on the doctor's porch one evening, sharing a bottle of whiskey and discussing the challenges of frontier life. "You know, Thomas," Doc had said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, "there are respectable women back east looking for good husbands, women who want a fresh start, a chance at a real partnership. These agencies, they're not what some folks think. They match decent people who just haven't found each other yet." The idea had taken root in Thomas's mind like a seed in fertile soil. For weeks he wrestled with it, pride warring with practicality. Was he so desperate that he needed to send away for a wife like she was a piece of farm equipment? What would his neighbors think? What would his late parents have said? But as autumn turned to winter, and winter gave way to spring, the loneliness had worn him down like water carving channels in stone. Finally, on a rain-soaked evening in March, he had sat down at his kitchen table with pen and paper. The letter had been harder to write than he expected. How did a man describe himself to a stranger? How did he explain what he wanted in a wife without sounding desperate or demanding? He had gone through 3 drafts before settling on words that felt honest without being too revealing. "I am a rancher in good standing," he had written in his careful script, 34 years old, of steady character and moderate means. "I seek a woman of virtue and intelligence who wishes to build a life in the West. I can offer a comfortable home, financial security, and the respect due a wife. I am not given to drinking or gambling, attend church regularly, and believe in treating all people with fairness and kindness." He had sealed the letter before he could change his mind again. Walking through the mud to the post office the next morning and handing it to Ezra Collins with a casual air that masked his thundering heart, the reply had arrived 6 weeks later. Miss Evangeline Cooper of Boston had answered his advertisement with a letter written in elegant script on cream-colored paper. She described herself as 26 years old, educated, and eager for a new beginning. She had lost both parents to influenza, she explained, and found herself alone in the world with limited prospects. The idea of marrying a respectable man and starting fresh in the West appealed to her sense of adventure. "I am not a beauty," she had written with refreshing honesty, "but I am told I am pleasant to look upon. I can read and write, manage a household, and am not afraid of hard work." I believe marriage should be a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. If you find my letter acceptable, I would be honored to become your wife. They had exchanged 3 more letters before making the arrangement official. Thomas had sent money for her travel expenses, and Evangeline had promised to arrive on the afternoon stage on May 15th. She would be carrying a blue carpet bag, she had written in her final letter, and would wear a yellow ribbon in her hair so he might recognize her. Now, as the stagecoach door swung open, Thomas felt as though he might be sick. What if she took one look at him and decided to climb back aboard? What if she was nothing like her letters had suggested? What if he was making the biggest mistake of his life? A well-dressed man in a city suit stepped down first, followed by an elderly woman clutching a wooden cane. Then, for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, no one else emerged. Thomas was beginning to wonder if Evangeline had changed her mind at the last minute. When a gloved hand appeared at the coach's doorway, a moment later, a woman stepped gracefully down onto the dusty ground, accepting the driver's assistance with a murmured word of thanks. She was not what he had expected. The woman standing before him was certainly pleasant to look upon, but her self-deprecation had been far too modest. She was, quite simply, beautiful. Golden hair swept back in an elegant style caught the afternoon sunlight, and even from a distance, he could see eyes the color of sage after rain. Her dress, while practical for travel, was finely made and spoke of good taste and careful attention to detail. But it was more than her physical appearance that left him momentarily speechless. There was something in the way she carried herself, a quiet dignity and self-assurance that spoke of inner strength. When she turned to survey the town, her gaze was intelligent and appraising, taking in her new surroundings with the careful attention of someone accustomed to making important decisions. She spotted the yellow ribbon in her hair at the same moment. He found his voice. "Miss Cooper." She turned toward him, and for a moment, their eyes met across the dusty space between the stagecoach and the sidewalk. He saw surprise flicker across her features, quickly followed by what he hoped was approval. "Mr. McKenna." Her voice was cultured, with just a hint of the crisp accent he associated with educated Easterners. "Yes, ma'am." He stepped forward, removing his hat as he approached. "Welcome to Copper Ridge." She smiled then, and the expression transformed her entire face. "Thank you. I must admit, the journey was longer than I expected, but the countryside is beautiful, much more beautiful than I had imagined." "You're not disappointed?" The words slipped out before he could stop them, betraying his nervousness. Her laugh was like silver bells in a gentle breeze. "On the contrary, Mr. McKenna, I find myself pleasantly surprised." As Colt unloaded her luggage substantial trunk, and the promised blue carpet bag, Thomas found himself tongue-tied in his letters. He had been eloquent and thoughtful. In person, faced with this remarkable woman who had traveled across the continent to marry him, he felt like a schoolboy meeting his first crush. "I've arranged a room for you at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house," he finally managed. "I thought you might like a few days to settle in, get to know the town, before we make things official." Something flickered in her eyes that he couldn't quite read. "That's very considerate of you." Mrs. Henderson appeared at that moment, drawn by the commotion of the stagecoach's arrival. She was a plump, motherly woman with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. "You must be Miss Cooper," she said warmly, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Thomas told me you'd be arriving today. Come along, dear. Let's get you settled. You look exhausted from your journey." Asterisk as the two women headed toward the boarding house, Thomas, following with the trunk, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. Evangeline Cooper was everything she had promised in her letters and more. She was educated, well-mannered, and undeniably lovely, making conversation that felt strangely formal after months of intimate correspondence. "Tell me about your ranch," Evangeline said, cutting delicately into a piece of roasted chicken. "Your letters made it sound like paradise." Thomas felt some of his nervousness ease as he described the land he loved. He told her about the rolling hills dotted with oak trees, the stream that ran year-round through the property, the view of the distant mountains from the front porch. He described the cattle that grazed in the pastures, the horses in the stable, the vegetable garden that provided fresh food through the growing season. "It sounds wonderful," she said, and he heard genuine interest in her voice. "I grew up in the city, but I've always dreamed of living in the country. There's something about the idea of wide-open spaces that appeals to me." "What about your life in Boston?" he asked. "You mentioned in your letters that you lost your parents." A shadow crossed her face, so brief he almost missed it. "Yes, the influenza epidemic 2 years ago. They died within days of each other." was ... I found myself quite alone. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. She took a sip of water and he noticed her hand trembled slightly. It was a difficult time, but it also made me realize that life is unpredictable. We must seize opportunities for happiness when they present themselves. They talked for another hour, covering topics from books to music to their shared faith. Thomas found himself increasingly impressed by her intelligence and depth of understanding. She asked thoughtful questions about the town, about his business, about his hopes for the future. Her responses revealed a sharp mind and a kind heart. But something nagged at him throughout the conversation. Several times, he caught her looking toward the window with an expression he couldn't quite identify. When a horse galloped past outside, she started visibly before composing herself. And when Mrs. Henderson mentioned that they occasionally had trouble with drifters passing through town, Evangeline's face went pale. Are you feeling well? Thomas asked with concern. Oh yes, she said quickly, her smile returning. Just tired from the journey. Perhaps we should call it an early evening, Thomas agreed, though he was reluctant to leave her company. As he walked back toward his ranch in the gathering twilight, he found himself more puzzled than ever. Evangeline Cooper was everything he had hoped for in a wife, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that she was carrying some burden she hadn't shared. The next morning brought unexpected answers. Thomas was in town early, picking up supplies at Morrison's general store, when a commotion outside drew his attention. Through the window he saw two men on horseback talking to Sheriff Dalton near the hotel. Even from a distance there was something about their posture and dress that suggested they weren't casual travelers. Bounty hunters, Morrison said grimly, following Thomas's gaze. Been asking questions about a woman who might have passed through. On yesterday's stage, Thomas's blood turned to ice. What kind of questions? Looking for someone named, let me see, Eleanor Whitfield. Said she stole money from her employer back east. There's a reward posted. Eleanor Whitfield, not Evangeline Cooper. Thomas felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The woman he had been ready to marry, the woman he had spent the evening with discussing their future together, might be a thief running from the law. Everything suddenly made sense. Her nervousness, the way she looked toward the windows, her visible fear when Mrs. Henderson mentioned drifters. But even as the evidence mounted in his mind, something deeper rebelled against the conclusion. The woman he had met, the woman whose letters had revealed such depth of character, didn't seem capable of theft. There had to be more to the story. He left Morrison's store without completing his purchase, and walked quickly toward the boarding house. He found Evangeline, or Eleanor, he supposed, sitting on the front porch, a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands as she stared out at the street with obvious anxiety. We need to talk, he said quietly, sitting down beside her. At him, and he saw his answer in her eyes before she spoke. You know, she said simply, I know there are men looking for Eleanor Whitfield. I know that's not the name you gave me. She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't steal anything, Thomas, at least, not the way they mean. Tell me. She took a shaky breath and began to speak. The story that emerged was nothing like what the bounty hunters had described. Eleanor Whitfield had been employed as a governess by the wealthy Hartwell family in Boston. For 2 years she had cared for their young daughter Margaret, treating the lonely child with the love and attention her busy parents rarely provided. The little girl had thrived under Eleanor's care, becoming confident and happy for the first time in her short life. But Eleanor had discovered something terrible about the Hartwells. Mr. Hartwell had been embezzling money from the bank where he worked, and when suspicion began to fall on him, he hatched a desperate plan. He would claim that money had been stolen from the house and blame Eleanor, the governess who had access to the family's private quarters. He planted marked bills in my room, Eleanor explained, tears streaming down her face. He was going to have me arrested, tried, and convicted. I would have gone to prison for something I didn't do, and he would have escaped with the money he really stole. How did you find out? Margaret overheard her father talking to his lawyer. She was such a bright child. She understood what they were planning. She came to me in tears, begging me not to let them send me away. That night she showed me where her father had hidden the money he planned to plant as evidence. Eleanor had faced an impossible choice. If she stayed, she would be framed for theft and sent to prison. If she ran, she would be branded a fugitive. But if she was imprisoned, what would happen to Margaret, the lonely little girl who had become like a daughter to her? I took the money he intended to plant, she admitted. I thought if I had it with me, I could somehow prove my innocence. I left a letter explaining everything, hidden where Margaret would find it when she was older. Then I ran, and came here. I've been moving west, staying ahead of the bounty hunters. I know it looks like I'm guilty, but I couldn't let an innocent child watch the only person who truly cared for her be destroyed by her father's crimes. Thomas sat in silence, absorbing the story. Everything about it rang true for Eleanor. He had come to know would absolutely sacrifice herself to protect a child. But he also understood the impossible position she was in. "What do you plan to do now?" he asked. "I don't know." She wiped her eyes with a trembling hand. "I can't marry you under false pretenses. And I can't stay here and bring trouble to your town. Those men will keep looking until they find me." Thomas stood up abruptly, his mind racing. "Come with me." "What? Come with me? There's something we need to do." He led her down the street to Sheriff Dalton's office, where the two bounty hunters were still talking with a lawman. All three men looked up as Thomas and Eleanor entered. "Gentlemen," Thomas said calmly, "I believe you're looking for this lady." Eleanor gasped beside him, but Thomas held her hand firmly. "Thomas, what are you doing?" she whispered. "Trust me," he murmured back. Sheriff Dalton, a fair man Thomas had known for years, studied Eleanor with careful eyes. "You're Eleanor Whitfield." "I am one of the bounty hunters." A thin man with cold eyes stepped forward eagerly. "There's a $500 reward for her capture." "Hold on." Sheriff Dalton raised a hand. "Before anyone goes anywhere, I want to hear her side of the story." Eleanor told her story again, this time with Thomas holding her hand for support. When she finished, the room was quiet except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. "That's a pretty tale," the cold-eyed bounty hunter said dismissively. "But the fact remains, she took money that didn't belong to her, money that was being planted to frame her," Thomas pointed out. "So she claims." Sheriff Dalton rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "I'll tell you what. I'm not entirely convinced this is a clear-cut case of theft. I'm going to send a telegram to the authorities in Boston. Ask some questions about this Hartwell fellow. Until I get answers, Miss Whitfield stays here under my protection." "You can't do that," the second bounty hunter protested. "We have a legal warrant, and I have jurisdiction in this county," Dalton replied firmly. "The lady stays put, until I'm satisfied about the facts." The bounty hunters argued for several more minutes, but Sheriff Dalton wouldn't be moved. Finally, they stomped out of the office, muttering threats about returning with federal marshals. "That bought us some time," Dalton said after they left, "but not much. If what you've told me is true, Miss Whitfield, we need to prove it quickly." Thomas squeezed Eleanor's hand. "How long do you think we have?" "Maybe a week, if we're lucky. Those men won't give up easily, and they'll be back with more legal authority." That evening, Thomas and Eleanor sat on his front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. The events of the day had left them both emotionally drained. But there was also a strange sense of relief in having the truth finally in the open. "Why did you do it?" Eleanor asked. "Why did you turn me into the sheriff instead of just letting me run?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully, because running isn't living. You can't spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, afraid of every stranger who rides into town. And because, double quotes, he paused, gathering courage, "because I love you." She turned to stare at him in surprise. "You barely know me. I know enough. I know you sacrificed your safety to protect a child. I know you chose to tell me the truth even when lying would have been easier. I know that in 3 days, you've become more important to me than anything else in my life." Tears gathered in her eyes. "Thomas, I may be going to prison. Even if Sheriff Dalton believes my story, the law may not care about the circumstances. Then we'll face it together. I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking. I'm choosing." The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Sheriff Dalton sent telegrams and waited for replies. Thomas consulted with the town's lawyer, a sharp young man named James Fletcher, who had recently arrived from St. Louis. Eleanor tried to make herself useful around Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, but her heart wasn't in domestic tasks. Every sound from the street made her jump, expecting to see the bounty hunters returning. On the 4th day, Sheriff Dalton received a reply to his telegrams that changed everything. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, reading the message twice to be sure. "Seems like your Mr. Hartwell got nervous when you disappeared. Miss Whitfield started making mistakes. The bank figured out what he'd been up to, and he confessed everything rather than face a trial. He's already been sentenced to 5 years. In prison, Eleanor sank into the chair across from his desk, tears of relief streaming down her face, and Margaret, the little girl, being cared for by her maternal grandmother, who apparently never liked Hartwell anyway. The old lady's been asking questions about you, actually. Seems the child has been telling everyone who'll listen about the governess who saved her from her father's schemes. So I'm free as a bird. The charges have been dropped, and there's even talk of the bank paying you a reward for exposing Hartwell's theft." Thomas, who had been holding his breath throughout the conversation, finally exhaled. "What about the bounty hunters? They'll be disappointed, but they'll have to find someone else to chase. Miss Whitfield is an innocent woman." That evening Thomas proposed to Eleanor properly, down on one knee on his front porch as the stars came out overhead. She said yes through happy tears, and they were married 3 days later in the little church on Main Street, with half the town in attendance and Mrs. Henderson crying tears of joy from the front pew. As Thomas carried his bride across the threshold of their home, he marveled at how much his life had changed in just 1 week. He had written to the matrimonial agency, looking for a practical arrangement, a partnership that would ease his loneliness and provide companionship in his later years. Instead, he had found true love. Eleanor adapted to ranch life with surprising ease. She learned to milk cows, tend the vegetable garden, and even helped with the cattle when extra hands were needed. But more importantly, she filled the empty spaces in Thomas's house and heart with laughter, conversation, and the deep contentment that comes from sharing life with someone who truly understands you. 6 months after their wedding, they received a letter from Boston. It was written in a child's careful script and addressed to Mrs. Eleanor McKenna. "Dear Eleanor," it read, "Grandmother says I can write to you now. I miss you every day, but I'm happy you found a new family. Grandmother says you're a hero for saving me from Papa's bad plans. When I grow up, I want to be brave like you. Please tell me about your new life in the West. I want to hear about everything. Love, Margaret." Eleanor read the letter aloud to Thomas as they sat on their porch in the evening, watching their cattle graze in the distance. When she finished, she wiped tears from her eyes and smiled. "She's safe," she whispered. "She's happy. Thanks to you," Thomas replied, pulling her close. "Thanks to us," she corrected. "You saved me just as much as I saved her." As the months turned into years, Thomas and Eleanor McKenna became pillars of the Copper Ridge community. Their ranch prospered, their love deepened, and their home was always open to neighbors in need. They never forgot how close they had come to losing each other before their life together had truly begun. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas would remember that day when the stagecoach had arrived carrying the woman who would change his life forever. He had thought he was getting a practical arrangement, a solution to his loneliness. Instead, he had received the greatest gift of all, a love story that began with secrets and ended with truth, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared courage, and a future filled with all the possibilities that two hearts could hold. The woman who had stepped off that stagecoach had indeed left him speechless, but in the end she had also given him everything he had ever dreamed of and more than he had ever dared to hope for. Their love story became legend in Copper Ridge, passed down through generations as proof that sometimes the most unexpected journeys lead to the most extraordinary destinations. And every time a stagecoach rolled into town, the old-timers would smile and remember the day when a secret brought two hearts together and changed their lives forever.